Let me start, and I'm really happy to have everybody who joined us today. Good afternoon to you, and thank you for joining the fifth CISMOR seminar for this academic year. Today we host Dr. Esta Ottman from Doshisha University. Let me say that we will have an hour of talk by Dr. Ottman, and then about 25 minutes of question and answer. We are recording this seminar, and it will be posted on the YouTube of CISMOR. So if you do not wish to have your video on, we understand that. I'm Ada Tagar-Cohen, and I'm the director of the CISMOR Center. And I am very, very glad to introduce to you our honored guest today. We are hosting Dr. Ottman, who was born 15 years after the end of World War II. She was born in Manchester in the United Kingdom and is a daughter of Kindertransport, Refugee, and grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust in a post-war Britain that had yet to embrace multiculturalism and tolerance. She arrived in Japan long ago via Israel-Palestine, where she lived for and worked for about a decade. Currently, Dr. Ottman is an associate professor at Doshisha University's Faculty of Global and Regional Studies. She has received her PhD at the University of Bradford's Department of Peace Studies and International Development in the United Kingdom. The PhD is entitled History's Wound, Collective Trauma, and the Israel-Palestine Conflict. She researches collective memory, memorialization practices, and their relationship to trauma, largely in the Middle East, but is often drawn back to the very personal and political topic of the long shadow cast by Holocaust and the instrumentalization of its memory. The title of her talk today is Stolpersteine, Remembrance, and intercultural and traumatic reevaluation of the Kindertransport. Dr. Ottman, please.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, Professor Cohen. I'm very glad to be here, and thank you to those of you who have tuned in, students, friends, and colleagues. So I'm going to start. I'll share screen and pray. So I will be breaking out to show videos of my father, my late father, talking. And because I lack technological capacity, I haven't made cuts, so I do beg everybody's patience. I'll be tuning them in, or cueing them in rather. So my title is Stolpersteine Remembrance, an intercultural and traumatic reevaluation of the Kindertransport. And you can see there in the photograph what Stolpersteine look like. And in fact, that is my family's Stolpersteine. I'll be speaking about that later. I was contacted by a professor of school in my father's hometown, and they decided to have a school project and a presentation, and lay the Stolpersteine for my family who lived there. So first I'll start off with an introduction of what is meant by Stolpersteine. They are stumbling stones. And I'll play this video. Please tell me if you can't hear. Okay, so that's a short introduction to what is meant by Stolpersteine. And I've entitled this Stolpersteine Remembrance because I think that people stumble not only over the stones, but over what they remember and how they remember this operation known as the Kindertransport, which happened in 1938, just before the outbreak of World War II. It happened as a result of the British government's and the Jewish community's reaction to Kristallnacht, and I'll be speaking about that. Now, it's normally represented as a feel-good story, and a great triumph on the part of the United Kingdom for taking in refugees. And indeed, I would not be here today to tell the story if it had not been for the Kindertransport. I have to acknowledge that from the outset. But I think that this story also has its dark side. And I and other people who have studied it believe that the time has come for a more critical reflection on this episode of British history. So this is the official explanation of why the Kindertransport was important. It saved 10,000 children approximately, but of course it was a small number in comparison to the 1.5 million children who died in the Nazi Holocaust, but still very, very important. And the Kindertransport organization describes this as the children being saved through the will of the British people, as expressed by their representatives in Parliament. Actions can be taken to save lives at the worst of times. So that's the reason for its importance, and for me, the personal importance. But what we also have to remember is those children had parents, and those parents were not welcomed and were not taken into the UK. And around 90% of the children who were brought to the UK in this extraordinary operation never saw their parents again. The children became orphans as a result of the Holocaust. Okay, so the Kindertransport holds a special warm and fuzzy place in public memory. It's a redemptive narrative of triumph of good over evil. In 2018, 2019, there were many celebrations of 80 years since the Kindertransport. There were many commemorative events, conferences in the UK and elsewhere. Before that, we'd had the 2015 refugee crisis in the Middle East as a result of the Arab pro-democracy uprisings. And these were still fresh in the British public's consciousness, and the Kindertransport is often linked to the refugee crisis, particularly through the work of the Labour MP, Lord Alfred Dubs, himself a former Kindertransportee. He was one of the children who escaped the Holocaust as a result of the actions of Nicholas Winton. I'll be speaking about him shortly. That's Lord Alf Dubs, and he proposed, as a result of the refugee crisis in Europe with the Syrian civil war and the huge floods of refugees occasioned by the so-called Arab Spring, he proposed an amendment to the immigration bill in the British Parliament. And he had to size it down and size it down and size it down. And he proposed that the government should take in 3,000 unaccompanied refugees at the end. I think he had bigger ambitions to start with. And to their shame, the MPs rejected the amendment. He also founded an NGO called Safe Passage UK to help unaccompanied child refugees. I'll play a little bit of a video introducing his NGO.
Globally, it's estimated that there are 24.5 million refugees in the world, and more than half of them are children, and many of those will spend their entire childhood in displacement.
At the moment, we're seeing a level of displacement, disadvantage and vulnerability that we've possibly not seen for centuries in our world. The levels of displacement, the numbers of people who are refugees from their homes and their countries is now at a quite unprecedented level.
In the first 6 months of this year, we saw that over 10,000 children tried to get into a number of European countries, and around half of those are actually unaccompanied or separated children, so they're particularly vulnerable.
Young people are in great danger of being trafficked, of being lured into criminality or into prostitution. It is an appalling way for us to treat young people.
This is a problem about the stability and the well-being of the world, but it's also a problem about our own self-respect, our own moral dignity, our own capacity to rise up and confront a challenge and do something about it.
This is the 80th anniversary of the Kindertransport movement, and it's a hugely important time for us in the UK to look back and to celebrate exactly what happened at that time.
I love this, my adopted country now, with a passion that perhaps only someone who had lost their human rights can feel.
We look back and we think 10,000 would be wonderful. And so we argue that if Britain could do it then, Britain can do it now.
These delays go on. Children grow up, they're missing education, they're not getting in here, and they're still hungry.
Much more can be done, particularly in the areas of unaccompanied and separated children who are hugely vulnerable and often trying to trace their families or seeking support and guardianship.
If it was your kid, if it was your city being bombed, your street on fire, your child separated from you, what would you want for it? How would you want the world to look after it?
So a message then maybe to Priti Patel, the British Home Secretary. And one is haunted perhaps by the memories from that time, particularly the photograph of the Kurdish Syrian refugee child, Alan Kurdi, who was washed up on the shores of a Greek island. So those viral images sparked British conscience, but not only could he not manage 10,000 refugees to be unaccompanied child refugees to be brought to the UK, he couldn't manage 3,000. The redemptive narrative can be found also, and the direct linkage with the Kindertransport in the comments which were widely publicized of the late Chief Rabbi of the UK, Lord Jonathan Sacks, and talking about the Syrian refugee crisis, the refugee crisis in 2015. He said this: "The last few days have brought back images that we thought we would never see again. They take our mind way back to the Holocaust, and it is important to remember simple humanitarian gestures like the Kindertransport, which rescued 10,000 children and lit a light in the darkest period of history." I'm trying to play this interview. Okay, clip from it.
Catastrophe of 2 world wars and the Holocaust. As it has not been tested since the Second World War. Angela Merkel is entirely right here. The European Union was created as a kind of way of saying we recognize human rights after the catastrophe of 2 world wars and the Holocaust, and it's very chilling to see some of these scenarios being reenacted. I don't want to make a direct comparison, but now is the time for humanitarian compassion to triumph over what seemed to me to be quite dark and dangerous remarks.
I mean, in our lifetimes, have we seen in Europe a humanitarian crisis like this?
We haven't, and clearly some of the images that have emerged in the last few days have brought back images that we thought we'd never see again. You know, a young child lying dead by the seashore, people packed into transports, ships overloaded and capsizing. These take our mind way back to the Second World War, to the Holocaust. And it's important to remember that one simple humanitarian gesture, Kindertransport, which rescued 10,000 Jewish children from Germany, only 10,000 out of 6 million, but it lit a light in one of the darkest periods of history. And
however, I'd like to point out that very simplistic characterization of the humanitarian gesture, it's a largely uncontested narrative frequently associated with the Kindertransport. And the linkage to the present day refugee crisis is somewhat problematic because it indulges in a lot of nostalgic revisionism. This is an article by Polly Toynbee in the Guardian newspaper, and she's highly critical of the narrative of historical self-congratulation in the UK about the Kindertransport. And she says that the children were taken in, but they were taken away from their parents because we didn't want adult Jews. And that's a key point, really. So a little bit about the historiography of the Kindertransport. There was a long period of silence before the survivors began to publish their narratives of World War II and the Kinder themselves. And around the 1980s, the floodgates were opened. People started to publish their memoirs, and British social historians began to take an interest in recording the testimonies of Holocaust survivors. And my own father's testimony was recorded, and we'll see a little bit of that. This period of silence is usually described as a characteristic of trauma. What prompted it were the anniversaries. For example, the reunion of the Kindertransport, which was organized by a woman called Bertha Leviton, a kind, as they began to call themselves, who put a notice in the Jewish Chronicle, hoping to attract refugees. And this reunion took place in June 1989. 1,200 people and spouses and children came from all over the world, all parts of the world, not just the UK, to meet friends and to celebrate their survival. Around that time also, the Association of Jewish Refugees, of which my parents are memories, also surveyed surviving kinder and collected data, and you can access this data. You can see that there were slightly more girls than boys, and that the kinder frequently arrived with siblings, and this was the case with my father. So some of the origins of the easy, uncomplicated, redemptive narrative go back to a publication called A Great Adventure, the story of the refugee children's movement, which was one of the organizations that was responsible for coordinating the Kindertransport and taking care of the children. And it was written supposedly by someone called John Presland, but actually that was a pseudonym for a woman called Gladys Skelton Bendit, who was one of the co-founders of the refugee children's movement. This kind of self-congratulatory narrative goes back to her. It is not a small thing in these years of suffering without parallel to have given 10,000 children the opportunity to grow up in an atmosphere of decency and normality, to work, play, laugh, and be happy, and to assume their rightful heritage as free men and women. The truth about that is somewhat or slightly different, I would say. And together with the discovery of Sir Nicholas Winton, this kind of also contributed to this redemptive, congratulatory narrative. Sir Nicholas Winton left us in 2015 and was knighted by the Queen for his work in the Kindertransport. One of the most famous revelations of what he had done came about as a result of a very popular BBC TV program called That's Life, in which they talked about how he had done what he had done. It had been a secret, no one had known about it before then. And they brought together many of the kinder who he had saved.
There are some stories which we're not only an audience to, but may become their participants. Nicky's story came out by accident after this scrapbook surfaced after gathering dust for decades. Once it did, though, it set about a whole chain of incredible events.
That's me before I left for England. But until 1988, I had no idea who had rescued me from all but certain death. It was this old man who had saved my life and that of hundreds of others in the Second World War. Yet for 50 years, we knew nothing about him.
4 children. This is his scrapbook. There are all kinds of fascinating pictures in it. Perhaps you can see, this is a picture of Nicholas Winton himself with one of the children he rescued. If you look at the very back of this scrapbook, fascinating things in it, all the letters. But back here is the list of all the children. This is Vera Diamant, now Vera Gissing. We did find her name on his list. Vera Gissing is with us here tonight. Hello, Vera. And I should tell you that you are actually sitting next to Nicholas Winton. Hello.
I wore this around my neck, and this is the actual pass that we were given to come to England, and I'm another of the children that you saved.
Can I ask, is there anyone in our audience tonight who owes their life to Nicholas Winton? If so, could you stand up, please?
So it's a little bit syrupy, especially the music, but I can't help it. Every time I watch that, I start to snuffle. Maybe it's the music. So Sir Nicholas Winton was known as Britain's Tune Sugihara, or Britain's Oscar Schindler, and organized a rescue operation that brought approximately 669 children. I think they're not sure of the number, mostly Jewish, from Czechoslovakia to safety in Great Britain. And he was a Labour politician, but one thing that set him slightly apart from his British peers was his cultural background. He was not born Nicholas Winton, he was born Nicholas Werkheimer in the UK. And his parents were of German Jewish ancestry, and they baptized him. And this is not uncommon. People felt that their children and themselves would have an easier time if they no longer remained Jews. And he was a stockbroker by profession, and he was invited by a friend to visit the friend in Czechoslovakia, where he had traveled in his capacity as an associate of the British Committee for Refugees in Czechoslovakia. And Winton saw that the writing was on the wall for Europe. He realized that there was a war about to happen and decided to go, and he met his friend Blake and a woman called Doreen Warriner, who arranged for him to visit refugee camps, which were filled with Jews and political opponents to Nazism from the Sudetenland. And he was further alarmed by the violence of the Kristallnacht riots, and then he heard about Kindertransport and decided to organize a similar independent rescue operation of his own. And he began to take lots of applications without any authorization from parents at his hotel in Prague. And basically that's how he managed to get out as many children as he could. And he convinced people in the UK to allow the children in. He went backwards and forwards between Europe and the UK to raise money for the transports, and the £50 per child guarantee demanded by the British government to allow them in, because the children were not allowed in unless certain conditions were met. I'll be speaking about those. And he had to find British families willing to care for the refugee children. So that's the story of Nicholas Winton. His first transport of children left in March 14th, 1939, just before the Germans completely occupied the Czech lands. And the last trainload of his children left in August 1939. And his activities came to a halt when Germany invaded Poland and Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939. So for a long time after the war, his efforts remained unknown, but then his wife found a scrapbook in the attic about the one that you saw in that slide program, about the children with their lists of names, their photos, and decided to publicize what he had done. And in addition, there were lots of other documentaries which contributed to this narrative of redemption, such as Into the Arms of Strangers. I'm not going to play the trailer for that in the interest of time. I'll skip to the next slide. And sorry, there began to be works after that, which were somewhat less self-congratulatory and more critical of the British government's attitude towards refugees at the time. One of the key works is by a woman called Louise London, Whitehall and the Jews, and another by Tony Kushner and Catherine Knox, refugees in an age of genocide. So people started to ask questions. So this next slide is a close-up of my father's own Stolpersteine. I mentioned that I received emails, as did many members of my family, that his family in his native town of Gladbeck would be remembered with Stolpersteine, and there was a ceremony. And the school children of a school in that town organized a project and a presentation and lots of research surrounding the family and their stories. And that's the artist who was mentioned in the World Jewish Congress video, laying the Stolpersteine. This is the woman who contacted me, Dr. Carmen Gieser from the Heisenberg Gymnasium. And it's a personal email from her. I couldn't go at the time, I can't remember why, but some members of my family were able to attend the ceremony, and she describes it as really dignified. And the school kids researched the family, my family, my grandparents and my uncles and my father. And there was a commemoration. Everybody remembered the people who got their Stolperstein. And the artist of the Stolpersteine project, Gunther Denmig, came to Gladbeck to lay the stones in front of everybody. I felt a little bit strange about this. It's very, on one hand, I'm very pleased that Germany does remember and doesn't forget its past. On the other hand, it's a very weird feeling to have your family as part of a school project, an activity. So you wonder what was their personal reaction or investment in that, a school project for something that was very personal to me. And then in 2018, I got this letter from World Jewish Relief about a landmark agreement that's relevant to survivors of the Kindertransport. The German government agreed to make some kind of compensation. I guess it's an additional one. There were compensation payments in the past, but those were to Holocaust survivors. This is for the Kindertransportees. And those Kindertransportees who are still alive were offered a one-off payment of 2,500 euros, around 2,250 pounds at the time. And they announced this with a great fanfare at the claims conference. And I was asked to contact anybody in my family who was surviving. But of course, it was way too late. So I had a lot of questions about that. And this is a slide about the conference, and the Smithsonian reported on the material claims conference. So I wondered, why now? Why so late? Even if a Kindertransport child had been a baby at the time of the transport, he or she would be over 80, and many of them have passed away. And why this token amount of money? So this is my father. He was at last surviving of his brothers of the Ottman Kinder, and he died in 2015. And he was from this town of Gladbeck in Germany. You can see it on the map. It's close to the Dutch border. I have to break out of the PowerPoint in order to share with you him talking as he was recorded about this by the AJR, the Association of Jewish Refugees. So I'll attempt to share this video now. It's playing somewhere, but I'm not sure where. Hold on, here it is. I'm interviewing Harvey Ottman, and today's date is Sunday, the 17th of October 2004. The interview is taking place in Leeds, Yorkshire, England, and I am Rosalind Livshin. Okay, so if you can tell me first your name.
My name is Harvey Ottman.
And what was your name at birth?
Isidore Herman. There is a reason for that, because at the time of my birth, all Jewish children had to have an identifying Jewish sounding name. Consequently, the Isidore was added to the front of my name. But it appears only on my birth certificate.
And the surname stayed the same?
The surname is the same, Ottman.
And when were you born?
The 28th of January 1927.
And where were you born?
Gladbeck in Westphalia, a small town near Essen.
Now, if you tell me your parents' names and where they were born.
My father's name is Solomon Ottman. He was born in Przemysl, Poland. It's a little difficult to spell, but I'm sure you can find that out somewhere. And my mother's name was Esta. She was born in Chodorów, Poland, both Poland.
And how did they come to Germany, with them both starting off in Poland?
Well, they travelled through Austria and followed the route that my late uncle took, who settled also from the Chodorów area, settled in Gladbeck. And that's the town that they settled in. The exact route, I don't know.
Why did they come there?
Well, my father was a very religious man. He taught Hebrew as a language even in the 30s, when it was quite unknown to speak Ivrit. He was a scholar, studied at the Przemysl Yeshiva, and he wanted to come somewhere where he could practice and teach. His aim was mainly to teach the living Hebrew language. So my uncle already lived in Gladbeck, so he said, well, if you come here, you'll sort of work for me as a bookkeeper. I'm a very religious man. He taught Hebrew as a language even in the 30s, when it was quite unknown to speak Ivrit. He was a scholar, studied at the Przemysl Yeshiva.
Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead. My father repeats himself quite a bit. He was recovering from cancer at the time. You'll hear that he kind of he repeats his story quite often. So that was his background. And this is actually, if you saw the posters on campus, this was the family house in Gladbeck. It was a two-family house. The families were related, the Ottmans and the Kaufmans. It still exists, so I think it's missing a story. My brother and various cousins have visited it. I think they said to me it's now a video rental store or something like that. My grandfather's in the photograph, my grandmother up there, various aunts. There's an aunt, there's an uncle, there's an aunt. But the majority of the people, of course, perished in the Holocaust. This is my grandmother at age 17, originally from Poland, as he mentioned. She later became Esta, and had 3 children and was widowed, and then remarried, had 4 more boys. And these are the 4 boys that came to the UK. That's the lineup. That little boy there is my father. One of the boys was too young to make it onto a Kindertransport and came independently somehow with my grandfather. The older children from her first marriage smuggled themselves in or emigrated to Palestine as young pioneers. My uncle Doshisha was quite a character. He did all kinds of activities such as road rolling in the Middle East. That's him in Bahrain in the photo. And according to family law, was offered land by Ben Gurion, but refused to take it and ended his days alone, rather poor, in a tiny flat near Tel Aviv, making Yemenite style jewelry and enamel jewelry. My other aunt, Judith Span-Mechner, also emigrated illegally to Palestine through a Jewish youth movement. And my third aunt from the first marriage stayed in Germany with my grandmother, excuse me, and they crossed the border on foot to Amsterdam, to Holland, where they were hidden by Dutch families. And here's my grandmother wearing the famous Juderstar that the Nazis forced people to wear. This picture's from Amsterdam. My brother colorized it, and I rather like that because it makes her less distant in time. My aunt spoke quite good Dutch and used to go out without her star on the streets in Holland at the time. She told me she worked as a milliner, so she somehow managed to get out and about. Jews have been living in Germany for a long time, since the 5th century CE, and many of them became very assimilated into German society during the period of the Enlightenment. There was a very high percentage of German Jews who fought for Germany in World War II, and about 12,000 of them died. And then the population of Jews started to swell with immigrants from Russia and Poland, Ostjuden, mostly escaping pogroms and persecution. And my family were this kind of Ostjuden. My father says in the video that his father wanted to come to Germany to teach, but I think it was also anti-Semitism and persecution that drove him from Poland. And of course, there were numbers of Jews who converted to Christianity during the period of the Enlightenment, and also to further their careers. So at the outbreak of the rise of National Socialism in January 1933, there were some 500,000 Jews living in Germany. Immediately, Adolf Hitler's government launched a campaign of persecution against the Jews. And there began to be various anti-Semitic decrees and boycotts, Jews couldn't go to public places, they couldn't buy kosher meat, they couldn't buy Jewish newspapers. And in 1935, the Nuremberg laws were made, which made it a crime to be married to a Jewish spouse. There were many mixed couples. It deprived German Jews of their citizenships. They couldn't visit any public parks, cinemas, and swimming pools. And it became impossible to attend schools or university. And of course, people started to leave in numbers, but many assimilated Jews clung to the idea that this was temporary and it would pass. This is a quote from Chaim Weizmann from The Guardian. The world seemed to be, he was the first president of the State of Israel, to divide it into 2 places, those places where Jews could not live and those where they could not enter. So people often wonder, why didn't the Jews see these signs? Many of the very assimilated could not imagine that civilized Germany, with its great tradition of literature and its music, could tolerate the Nazi government for long. They just thought that it was an aberration and it would pass. But there were lots of events that exacerbated the Second World War, and the demise of the Jews, the Anschluss in 1938, the Union of Germany and Austria, which trapped about 185,000 Austrian Jews, 95% of them living in Vienna. When Czechoslovakia was partly ceded in 1938 to Germany, which brought Czech Jews under Nazi control. This is when Nicholas Winton visited Czechoslovakia and started his activities. And in response, there was a conference to deal with the refugee problem of Jews trapped in Hitler's Reich, proposed by President Roosevelt of the United States, held in the French resort town of Evian, attended by 31 countries. And that was an 8-day conference, but nothing much came out of it. And many countries refused to accept the immigrants. So what actually sparked the events leading to the Kindertransport, there was something called the Polish Action in 1938, when the Nazis expelled 17,000 Jews of Polish heritage to the Polish border, and Poland refused them entry. They remained in very harsh refugee camps in no man's land for about a year. And a young man called Herschel Greenspan, one of those whose families were in the refugee camp in the town of Szbazin in Poland, got a letter from his family talking about the terrible conditions. And he was so enraged by this that he went and bought a gun. He planned to shoot the German ambassador, but as it happened, the day that he got into the consulate, the embassy, he got a minor diplomat called Ernst von Rath and shot and killed him. And this provoked the Nazi government, declared it an act of war, and they unleashed their rage on the Jewish community in the form of Kristallnacht, which my father well remembers. The night of broken glass, in which about 2,000 synagogues were burned, 7,500 Jewish businesses were destroyed. The numbers of Jews who were killed during that time are not exactly known. It could be 96, it could be 236, and 30,000 Jewish men were rounded up and sent to concentration camps. And at this point, my grandmother decided to send her 4 sons away to the UK via the Kindertransport. So I'm going to try and now show a video of my father talking about the conditions at the time.
But it's something that sticks in your mind. And other than that, of course, the general sort of, we had a home childhood, extremely happy home childhood. But schooling was something quite different. You see, we used to regularly, we had to walk to school, obviously. And then when the anti-Semitism grew fiercer and fiercer, and when the teachers themselves used to come in uniform at times, the Jewish pupils, and excuse me, there were 2 in that particular in my class. They were sort of separated, and they were no longer had to take part in any lessons. We were sat on our own, 2 rows behind all the others, and you just sat there and listened. You weren't obliged to do any work, and the teacher was a particularly anti-Semitic teacher who spouted the the line of the party, you see, and which was, of course, extremely uncomfortable. But I had to endure that.
Did you have any non-Jewish friends?
No, that was not possible. Because when we were children playing out, we played generally, as I say, at the back of the house, but we had in front of the house was a large pavement leading down the road, and at the edge near the road there was a cycle track. And this is something silly that sticks in your mind, that we were very keen on cycling, roller skating and all that sort of thing. On one occasion my brother Jack was cycling, and two boys were one on either side of the track. He didn't see them, and as he came cycling up, they pulled a tight rope across and he went flying over the front of the handlebar, and he was injured, very, very badly injured, and it took him many months to recover from that. So we never really played with any non-Jewish children or had any non-Jewish friends at all there.
And at school, had you become friendly at all with any of the class?
No, they were afraid to speak to you, because as I say, they used to spout the Nazi propaganda, what the Jews were and how we must treat them as lepers. And on the way to and from school, the very famous paper called the Stürmer, that was very well posted so that you couldn't miss it. And of course it sort of had a shrinking effect on us. When we read all these things, we would come home and say, are they true? But of course we know it not to be so, and well, you just lived with it until well, it's in 1938 that I came to England.
Just staying before that time.
So I'm going to go on to talking about
but unfortunately I haven't people. Yes, we not with us of that.
You know, you mentioned at the beginning that your family were in prison twice.
Yes.
So what was the second?
I don't know. The second, the first time, prior to Kristallnacht, we were imprisoned overnight because they wanted to sort the men out to go to labor camps. So the women were sent home, and we were children. We were sort of sent home with the women the following day, and then the men were sorted out. Those that were going to the camps deported, but they allowed my father to go home because he was classified as a teacher. So because he was a teacher, they let him stay.
So I had to skip in the interest of time, but he gives a description of Kristallnacht and being arrested and coming back to find the house smashed up and all his father's Hebrew books torn up, and there was nothing left, and they didn't have money to repair or replace things. These are some of the famous photographs of burned synagogues, smashed shops, Nazi thugs looting and rioting in the street. It was literally all over Germany and East Prussia. And after that time, the Nazi government decided the Jews had to clean it up and had to pay for the repairs. And still there was very few countries willing to take in refugees. And that's when the Kindertransport began. The foreign minister, Samuel Hoare, a Quaker, persuaded the British government to allow in young people. think up to age 17, something like that. But they had to be very careful. The refugee situation in the UK, then as now, was a rather delicate topic. Britain was still recovering from the Depression, the 1930s, and the government was frightened that an influx of refugees would create chaos. It might threaten British jobs. And if children were allowed, then parents might follow. So they didn't allow the parents who died. And the first refugees were the Spanish children from the Civil War, from Bilbao, who had been allowed, and then the Kindertransport were the second. The people who approached Samuel Hoare were not Jewish. They were various Christian organizations. Many Jewish MPs were afraid to stir up racial hostility and anti-Semitism by making demands, and they kept silent. So these were the conditions that were required to be on a Kindertransport. There had to be a £50 bond posted. The children traveled in sealed trains with a very tiny backpack. My father talks about this. The first transport left in December 1938, less than a month after Kristallnacht, and the last one in September 1939, just before Britain entered the war. And by this time, around 10,000 children had made the trip. The children who had the hardest time were the ones who were known as non-Aryan Christians, or Mischlinge, who were the products of mixed marriages or had maybe one or two Jewish grandparents. And they suffered the same humiliation and injustices as Jews without comprehending why this had been visited on them. And many of them were also interned as enemy aliens on the Isle of Man, as my grandfather was. Older refugees who came to the UK were put in a particular refugee camp, along with Nazis and Italian fascists. This is the route they took through Europe. It was thought at the time that they would be sent back to Germany after the war, but of course they couldn't be. And many of the refugee organizations realized that. And this is a kind of roll of honor of the Christian organizations and Jewish people who were involved in saving the children. You'll see the Quakers were particularly important. Here's some more roll call of honor for Christian groups that were involved in the Kindertransport. Many of these groups were housed in Woburn House and Bloomsbury House, and that's where most of the documents were kept. So I'm a little bit running out of time now, I think. I wanted to talk very much about the fact that many vulnerable children were often taken advantage of in this situation. There was, when they arrived, they were put in camps or hostels, and if the children didn't already have foster parents, people came to choose their little refugee child. And girls were the most popular. Older boys didn't get chosen. Older girls were often taken on as maids to work in the households. And there are lots of tales of abuse, sexual abuse, trauma. Often the kinder didn't get on with their families, or the families decided they didn't want them, and so they were placed in different homes again and again, and then many of them were also evacuated. And many of them were placed in homes of non-Jewish families because the idea was to diversify the kinder so that they wouldn't all be congregated in the main cities where the Jewish families were. So they were put all over the UK, and There was all kinds of religious conflict, cultural conflict. Unfortunately, I don't have time, but I'd like to have played the video of my father talking about the fact that it was drilled into them that they had to eat, sleep, and dream in English, and to forget their native culture and their native language. And that kind of trauma actually caused him to lose and blot out most of his German memories, not just his language. He claimed not to remember German or speak it, but also his memories. So a lot of the things that were done to the children, abuse, sexual abuse, harassment, proselytization, forced conversion, or encouraging children to convert to Christianity because they felt very lost and vulnerable. These are the perhaps the uncontested narratives which are not explored. And a woman called Jennifer Craig Norton has recently published a book about that. And she kind of lifted the lid on this triumphal narrative. And she talks about when the Kinder were paraded for adoption after they arrived. Tales of emotional deprivation, deprivation of food, abuse, lack of affection, because of course British people don't express affection so openly. Lots of emotional scarring and trauma and proselytization.
And to tell the truth, the stories about at least for me, I'm very much familiar with the stories of those kids, but never had a real, or a person talking about it. So it would be really interesting to listen to your father from my perspective.
Okay, I will try and share screen again. And
so this is the interview with Harvey Ottman, and it's take 2. So I was just asking if there was any other memories from your childhood that you might want to tell us about before we move on to the next stage.
Sorry, I should ask, could you hear that?
Yes,
in this one, this is what I mentioned when he's told about, it's drummed into him that he needs to speak only English. So I hope that'll work.
The childhood memories are linked up to something that happened at the next stage, but it's worthwhile mentioning it at this stage because once we, I have to just skip a few days and so on. Once we were placed in a home in England, in Welwyn Garden City, I'll come to that in a moment, the teaching there was such that all the children obviously were traumatized, and they were varying ages, and the teacher there said that you must, at all costs, if you're going to live a normal life, blot out these memories and speak only the language that you're going to speak now. Hence, I don't speak German, I won't speak German. I don't speak it. And he said, the only time that you're going to settle and know that you're going to settle in England is when you think and you count in English, and when you lay back and close your eyes, all you'll think of is English. Consequently, a lot of memories are blotted out by those early experiences in Welwyn Garden City.
There was one question that I hadn't asked, and that was, if you ever went anywhere for entertainment or remember the day of departure and how you were feeling at the time?
I can't, honestly, that I can remember the exact date of the departure and how I was feeling, but when we landed, I felt very lonely and alone. although we were very lucky in that respect, there were 3 of us together. And everybody that we came into contact with, they rather envied the fact that there were 3 of us and that we were so close together, which we had been all our lives. We played together all that time, and we sort of known as the Ottman boys.
Do you remember the journey at all?
No, all I ever remember from that is the landing. And I did speak a moment ago of the fact that it was so cold. It was extremely cold. And the accommodation that we were given, there were old army huts. It was an army barracks, extremely sparse. And there wasn't enough accommodation, sleeping accommodation, for everybody. So 3 of us slept in one bed, top to tail.
And how long were you there?
About, excuse me, somewhere between 3 and 4 weeks. Because this particular, I beg your pardon, I just moved back in one. In the Lowestoft camp, we were only 2 weeks. And that's all.
Yeah, you can hear a loud tummy grumble. Either it's the interviewer or my father. Yeah, I'm replying to your message, Ada. She asks the age of my father and his brothers. So he was the youngest of the 3 brothers who came on the transport, although the very youngest, Morris, came separately, and each brother was about a year or 2 apart. I think my father was about 11. And then you had Jack and Solly. And Ishiguro Anri says, she's researching Henrietta Scholl and Youth Aliyah. Can I give her some more cases about Jewish children who were converted to Christianity? Can I email you about that? Because I need to, I'd have to give you some specific cases. There's quite a lot of data. It would take an email maybe to give you more details. So if you would give me your email, I'll save the chat. So my father and his brothers were placed in different foster homes. I'll try to get to that part. And that's around the 11-minute mark. And they were lucky in that they were in Jewish foster homes. That wasn't the case with the majority of kinder.
So how did you come to move from that home?
Well, it's difficult to say what, I say difficult, I don't know what went on behind the scenes, but there were movements afoot right across the country to take in German refugees, or refugees, not necessarily German, refugees that arrived on the Kindertransport. Or most of the big cities and country towns, villages, you had volunteers. And the volunteers that you took up, that I myself went to a house in Bignor Street, a family called Davidson. Became my foster parents until after the war.
So were you separated from your brothers?
Yes, we all were separated. I was placed in Davidson. My middle brother was placed in a house by Mr. and Mrs. Beer. They lived in Cedar Street, which is no longer there. And oldest brother Solly was in a house with Mr. and Mrs. Rich, both of them deceased.
And where did they live?
Somewhere off Water Road, I just can't remember the exact address.
So you all went to Manchester?
Oh, yes, the three of us went to Manchester.
What happened to the other children?
I don't know. The only contact that we ever had of one boy who, after coming to England, went to Canada. And there was an odd occasion when he surfaced in Manchester, and he became very friendly with my brother Jack. And we actually made contact with him, but I have no idea where or where any of the other children are.
Okay, so he's talking about the fact that he went from the children's home to foster families.
What happened after the war?
Yeah, that's what I'd like to come to. What happened after the war? What he contradicts himself a few times because he was recovering from cancer in the video. But they managed through the offices of the Red Cross to contact all the family members who were still in Europe. For example, my aunt and my grandmother who were in hiding in Amsterdam. And my grandfather had been in an enemy alien camp on the Isle of Man. I actually have some slides about this. And so the Red Cross managed to arrange a reunion, but he says it took them about 5 years before they could all live together. But my aunt remained in Holland because she married and she had a child there and eventually emigrated to Israel. It was only my grandmother who came to the UK to be reunited with her 4 sons. And then the elder children were already in Israel, Palestine anyway. So
did they keep their Jewish identity afterwards? I mean, your family.
That's the thing. I'm just skipping ahead. There's actually an interesting slide in which my father talks about that. Because he was with, and he also talks about it in the video, he was with families, he was with a family that was much less orthodox than him. So he had to eventually let go of a lot of his religious practice. He still remained relatively religious, but you couldn't, if you were living with families who were much more liberal, you couldn't continue with that kind of lifestyle. So as for the non-Jewish families who took in Jewish child boarders, there were lots of cultural difficulties, and this kind of thing is what led to conversion. But my father retained his Jewish identity, as did all his brothers. I'm trying to get to the interview with my father, where he talks about this. This is it. Tensions between parents and children after not living together for a decade. So after there were these reunions, I mean, of course, it only happened for about 10% of the Kinder, because most of them had lost their parents in the Holocaust. They had to kind of renegotiate their religious practice and their religious identity. And his parents, of course, they were severely traumatized. He talks about that in the video. They had to kind of agree to a slightly more liberal lifestyle. This is an interview that my father gave to keep some sort of harmony within the family home. Ottman remembered upholding customs that we used to do rather than the things we were doing today, and he did an approximation of that. A parallel space was agreed. While they all lived together as a family, that's the 3 brothers and the parents, they kept their Orthodox lifestyle, but outside the home, and they were slightly more liberal, but they kept the Sabbath, they kept all the festivals while they were living at home. And then, of course, the boys married and were free to do, to a certain extent, what they wanted to. They kept their identities, but maybe not as, they were not as strictly Orthodox as they had been when they had lived at home. So that was one of the many issues of Kinder who were lucky enough to be reunited with parents. In some cases, they couldn't even speak to their parents because they had forgotten German. I don't remember, my grandmother died 1 year before I was born, 2 years before I was born, sorry. I don't, of course, I never knew her. They only vaguely remember my grandfather, and I don't remember if he spoke much English. So my father would have had to have dredged up his Yiddish or his German to communicate, I think. My cousin says he did, my grandfather did speak English. I don't remember him speaking much at all, actually. Yeah, so that was a common problem, I think, at that time.
And did your father feel completely British because he grew up since the age of 11? I mean, was there any feeling of conflict within him?
I know that he hated it if he bumped into another, if he encountered another Kinder in the street and they suddenly started to speak to him in German, because I saw it happen. He saw himself as British from there on, even though he retained to the end of his life some accent. You could hear that he was a native German speaker. But yeah, he felt great loyalty and thankfulness to the UK for taking him in. Always said he would never visit Germany, but I think he did once with my mother. There was a concert, Pavarotti concert, and they actually did make one visit to Germany in their later years. It was a very, very short visit, but many Kinder never went back, and might have retained some customs, might have retained some language. I didn't hear much German growing up except at family reunions.
And your mother was born in the UK?
Yeah, her family, they emigrated from Russia and Poland, and so she was second generation. I mean, she remembers her grandmother not being able to speak English. That's quite common for that generation, grandparents not knowing English. But yeah, she was very British and much more liberal in her Judaism, and forced my father to be more liberal just by dint of them living together. But you could tell it was difficult for him. It was always a conflict.
That's interesting. I have one more question.
I'm glad you're asking some questions.
Very, very fascinating for me as you know, as immigrants.
Right.
So the 4 years of the, I mean, the 6 years of the war probably made it difficult for the families that actually adopted these kids, because these years were not easy, I think, for anybody.
Right.
So if the kids were how should I say, were used to work the farms, I would say that within that situation of the war, maybe we should not look at it as such a horrible thing. It's only the question of how actually the kids were treated. Well, I mean, those kids did not starve. They were fed, they were dressed, and I mean, and we are in the war, and England really suffered during those
years. Yes, England children and families suffered the Blitz, and many kinder were evacuated. My father talks about being evacuated briefly also. Yeah, the kinder went through the war in the same way that British people went through the war. What I am saying, though, is that some families took advantage of the kinder. I can't put a number on it, but there's a lot of tales that were published of abuse. Working the farm may not have been the worst thing, but certainly some of the other cases of girls working as maids and so on, they were very problematic. There's a very good book by Iris Guske called Trauma and Attachment in the Kindertransport context, and she interviews various kinder who have some quite horrific tales to tell. So while we have to be very thankful to the British government and to people who took in the children, there were some very egregious cases of abuse. And that's what I think is worth exploring as a balance to this narrative of great generosity to refugees. And if you compare it to what's happening now, certainly that was a high watermark. If you look at the few unaccompanied child refugees that are allowed nowadays into the UK.
And other places.
And other places, yes. Yeah, I mean, Britain took in these Kindertransportees, but there were other countries that took in more refugees. Canada took in more refugees, for example. And we're talking about adult refugees, so yeah.
Is there statistics for how many of the children remained in the United States and how many left?
Yes, there's data on that. I would have to go to the AJR website, or there's an American organization for the Kindertransport. Of course, they were brought to the UK, many emigrated then later to the US and Canada. So there is data on that. But I think the majority of them remained in the UK. But yeah, there were people who emigrated, and that's why there's an American Kindertransport Association.
I see. I saw a question.
Good Lord.
Of Kotaro Hiraoka, please.
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I would like to know, my question is a little bit personal. When did you hear his story by himself?
Right.
First time. Yeah.
Only when we as a family that gathered to watch the video. He never spoke about it. It wasn't until that video was recorded, or that series of videos, there are 3 or 4, he refused to speak about the past. He believed in moving on, but I think that was also a function of trauma. And I think it's quite common. But then he joined the AJR, the Association of Jewish Refugees, where all they did was speak about the past, and that didn't sit well with him. He said, oh, those people, they're always going on and harping on about the past, and they should move on. And yeah, people have different responses. Everyone's different. But for my father, we could not get him to speak about his family or his past. And the only window I have are those videos. And they were only recorded after he'd had cancer very late in his life, in his 80s.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have a few more minutes, so we have one more question.
Izumi-san.
Hi, please.
I can see your hand. What do you want to ask?
Oh, okay. Well, Tina said, thank you very much, for sharing your the research. I think that the Japanese people, should know more about this, Kindertransport. And thank you very much, for letting us to hear your, fathers, the fathers talking. Okay, thank you. Well, and my question is, I guess in the UK, when I watch, some dramas or so in the 1940s, in the World War II, even the kids in the urban area, London or so in the UK, the kids had to evacuate to some rural areas. So I just thought that, your father went to the rural area, that kids weren't afraid of the air bombing. How were the kids in the UK, they had to evacuate, or the kids from the Kindertransported kids stayed in their excuse me for my poor English. So how were the kids?
You mean, what was the experience of evacuation?
They had an evacuation inside the UK.
During the Blitz,
and what is the relationship between the original living kids and newly coming kids?
According to the video that my father says, it was actually okay. He wasn't evacuated for very long. My mother remembers being evacuated. She wasn't a kinder, of course. She was evacuated to the countryside because she was from Liverpool, which was very heavily bombed during the Blitz. And there was a kind of town-country divide. And I think for all the kids who had never lived outside cities, the culture was quite different and a little bit difficult. My grandmother hated it so much that she took her children back to Liverpool and said, damn the Blitz, I don't care. I'd rather be in the city. So yeah, I think it was probably a double dislocation for Kindertransportees. They found their adopted families or their hostels in the city, and then they had to be evacuated. But it was something that happened to everybody during the war. It was just more marked and more traumatic for the Kindertransportees because of the strange cultural environment and the strange food and different customs.
I understand that. Yeah, I think, my mother was, 10 years old when the war, ended. And she evacuated with her, sisters, to the rural area of Machida City or so in Tokyo. Well, and she had hard time, the really hard time, and she could just say it, when she was in her 80s or so, she couldn't say that difficulties, when she was 40, 50 years old. So I understand,
But by say, you mean she felt she couldn't articulate, she didn't know how to say, or she didn't want to speak about?
A kind of a trauma. A kind of trauma.
Okay.
Yeah, so even inside of the the country who speak the same language and the same
sort of yeah.
It was so difficult. So I really want to understand that this issue. Thank you very much, Tina Sensei.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I think we will have to close down here. And I really wish to thank you, Dr. Ottman. It was really fascinating and very moving. In certain places, I cried as well. So don't worry about it.
Oh, did you see me with my tissue?
Yes, I was there also behind the and I was crying as well.
Oh dear. Okay.
Thank you very much, and I'm
Thank
sure
you for inviting me.
everybody was moved as well Thank you all for participating with us. Please follow up CISMOR homepage and you will see our next activities. So everybody, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everybody who came. Bye, Izumi. See you soon.